Around 19% of the population is estimated to have some sort of disability, but more often than not, they often find themselves left out of the kind of hero stories able people can enjoy. And when they are included, are stereotyped and stigmatized. Imagination is often lacking when it comes to telling the stories of disabled people.
What's bothering you?
She's so defenseless.
When the stories of disabled people are told, they are ripe with public mythology. People's ideas of what a blind person, a deaf person, or a person in a wheelchair are is often influenced by the media. So when characters with disabilities are portrayed in a certain and stereotypical way, it affects how people with these disabilities are seen in real life. For wheelchair users, this can manifest in the idea that someone in a wheelchair is always incapable of and will have no sexual capacity, or in some cases romantic capacity. In the 1935 film, Hands Across the Table, a character in a wheelchair is shown to quietly accept the fact that the person he loves will never love him due to the fact he isn't normal. He chooses to not propose to the female lead because he hears her talking about another man, and the audience is expected to infer that it is due to his disability. Not only that, but as the actor is not actually disabled, the chair is more suited as a prop than a piece of equipment. Misrepresentation like this means that real-life disabled people are thought of in this way too, and this can affect their relationships negatively. Deaf people have often expressed a discomfort at being included under the heading of disability. It is greatly misunderstood, therefore, as a disability and not a communication difficulty or an invisible handicap, which some deaf people prefer to be described as. Because speech reading is difficult and many deaf people prefer sign language, they are often left out of film and television as their manual communication is seen as a barrier to the hearing world. The ideas of Helen Keller, probably the most familiar person to be associated with blindness and deafness, was the subject of the 1962 movie The Miracle Worker. While the movie is about Keller, the title and the story center around the work and accomplishments of her caretaker, Anne Sullivan. While Keller is a learned and traveled person who is a prolific writer and had a great many accomplishments outside of overcoming her disability, most of the stories we hear about her revolve around her being blind, effectively erasing other parts of her, such as her activism. This is especially poignant as disabled people are often spoken over in other activist spaces. Another effect of The Miracle Worker, which we see in other instances of disability in film, is that it shapes how people see blind people, expecting them to be able to feel someone's faces to know them, or for a blind person to have no sight whatsoever. While this is true for some blind people, this isn't true for others, and having these stories be the reoccurring ones told over and over again in film and fiction shapes the public's view of disabled people and can often lead to sweeping generalizations that are hard to overcome. In a similar vein, when people with developmental disabilities are shown on film, their stories will generally fall into one of two categories: a feel-good story that is directly impacted by their disability, or a sad tale about how hard their life is and how hard it makes the lives of those around them. People with developmental disabilities, especially in older films, are usually portrayed as complacent, smiling, and forever childlike, which ignores their complexity and human emotional needs. The Special Olympics storyline, like in the 1978 film A Special Kind of Love, are usually a welcome addition to the portrayal of developmental disorders on screen, but have slowly started to become a stereotype even if many of the movies, like the one mentioned before, are done in a respectful manner. Autism and film do not have a long history together, as the stories of pervasive developmental disorders for a long time were not thought of as interesting. Popularity for stories involving autism grew after the success of the 1988 film Rain Man, which also helped raise public interest for the disorder. When more stories are told that include people with physical and mental disabilities, it allows for the audience to see disabled people just as complex as they see able people. Also, this opens up the opportunity for disabled people to work both on and off screen in the film industry, telling their stories in an accurate and respectful manner that serves to enrich both the film world and the audience.
It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes. Haven't you?
Some of the most stigmatizing representation is something that's very often overlooked: mental illness, especially in the context of horror movies. In fact, some of the most iconic stories of horror we can think of, The Shining, Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, and Carrie, deal with the idea of mental illness or at least going crazy. Especially within this genre, characterization usually means misrepresentation with dire consequences about the way we think of the mentally ill. In the 1960 film Psycho, we see the beginning of an archetype. a person completely out of touch with reality and severely mentally disturbed. This started the idea of killers who kill for pleasure or because of their own personal torment, or simply because they were just plain crazy. It is unfortunately not possible to get comprehensive within the psycho killer archetype due to the confines of this project, but it leads us back to one thing. While it makes for a thrilling story, it is not reflective of real life and can color people's views on the mentally ill, whether or not they are actually violent. Many other evil or antagonistic characters are coded with other mental illness within the horror genre. For example, the mad scientist archetype is heavily associated with traits of obsessive-compulsive disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. By turning the realities many people face into some form of horror, even if it's not put to a name, films can demonize the idea of mental illness and make it hard for people to separate a hyperbolic character from the insanity they're based on. All across film, in westerns and gangster movies and of course horror, we can see traits of personality disorders in our violent and villainous characters. A very specific example being the film based off Stephen King's novel Misery, where a character with very concrete traits of borderline personality disorder, such as unstable interpersonal relationships, unstable emotional states, perceived and imagined abandonment issues, abuses and physically maims a character in order to have complete control over him and assure that he can never leave her. The fact that horror draws so frequently on mental illness as something terrifying is troubling at best and stigmatizing at worst, as who wants their personal struggles to be seen as monstrosities?
Abed, you're special. Can't you just stand at the scene of the crime and see what happened?
I see a man using a social disorder as a procedural device. Wait. I see another man. Mildly autistic super detectives everywhere. Basic cable, broadcast networks. Pain. Painful writing. It hurts.
The way we portray disability and mental illness can affect the image the audience has of these people in real life. In order to avoid generalizing stereotypes, sometimes frustrating, sometimes harmful, it's important for disabled characters to be included in stories because they are people with stories worth telling, as all people are. Having actual disabled people involved in the filming process on and off screen allows for such representation to occur and opens the door for people to learn and be entertained at the same time.